If you believe that a mother's love can burn brighter than the coldest betrayal, and that justice, even when it seems impossible, will always find its way to the deserving, then you need to hear my story. Please subscribe and hit that like button, because the journey you're about to witness will stay with you long after it's over. NTHE cold was a living thing. It seeped up from the damp earth, through the thin, blood-soaked fabric of my hospital gown, and into my bones. My teeth chattered so violently, I thought they would break. I was huddled on the ground at the edge of the woods, miles from anywhere, with the vast, indifferent darkness of a moonless night pressing in on me. The only light was the faint, cruel glow of taillights disappearing down a dirt road. His taillights. Just hours before, I had brought 7 new lives into the world, 7 tiny, perfect daughters. A miracle delivered in the sterile, bright warmth of a hospital room. Now, those same daughters were nestled in a makeshift crib, a cardboard box I had found near a dumpster, at my feet. They were swaddled only in the thin, standard-issue hospital receiving blankets. It wasn't enough. Their tiny, whimpering cries were growing weaker, their fragile bodies losing a battle against the encroaching frost. NMY husband Mark, the man who had held my hand during the delivery, had driven us here. He'd told me it was a shortcut to his parents' house, where they were waiting to celebrate. He'd pulled over on this deserted road, telling me the engine was overheating. He'd coaxed me out of the warm car, holding 2 of our daughters, telling me to get the others. And the moment I had all 7 of my babies safely out of the vehicle, he had looked at me. There was no anger in his eyes, no hatred. There was something far worse. A calm, chilling finality. The inheritance, he had said, his voice flat. The trust my grandfather left me. The clause is very specific. I only inherit if I have a son to carry on the family name by my 30th birthday. That's next week. NHE had gestured to the 7 tiny bundles. 7 chances, he'd said with a sigh, as if discussing a failed business venture. And not a single one of them is worth a damn to me. You are a liability. They are a liability. Then he had gotten back into the car. He hadn't even spared them a glance. He had simply driven away, leaving me, his wife, still bleeding from childbirth, and his 7 newborn daughters on the side of a deserted road, without so much as a blanket to shield us from the killing cold. And I looked down at my babies. Their skin was turning a terrifying dusky blue. I was failing them. My body, which had created them, had no more warmth to give. The only warmth I felt was the hot, useless tears streaming down my face, freezing on my cheeks. He hadn't just left us. He had left us to die. He had given us a death sentence by exposure. And in that moment of absolute despair, a tiny, fierce spark ignited in my frozen heart. It was rage. Pure, primal, maternal rage. He thought he could erase us. He thought the cold and the dark would be his accomplices, silently disposing of his inconvenient family. He was wrong. I didn't know how, but I would survive this. I would save my daughters. And I would spend the rest of my life making him pay for this. I would become the blizzard that would one day find his door and bury him in the cold he had left us to die in. Mark's obsession with the sun wasn't just a preference. It was the central pillar of his identity. He was the sole heir to the Callaway fortune, a vast agricultural empire built over a century. But the empire came with a cruel catch, a stipulation in his grandfather's ironclad will. Mark had to produce a male heir before his 30th birthday to inherit the entirety of the estate. If he failed, the vast fortune, the sprawling lands, everything, would be dissolved and donated to a series of charities. He had until next week, and I met him in college. I was studying botany, fascinated by the resilience of life. He was studying business, learning how to manage the empire he was destined to inherit. He was charming, handsome, and he painted a picture of a future where I would be the queen of his kingdom. He never hid the condition of the will. In fact, he romanticized it. It's like a fairy tale, he'd say. We just need to have a prince to secure our castle. I was young and in love, and I didn't see the red flag. I saw it as a shared goal, a quest we were on together. We married right after graduation, and the quest began immediately. But our path was fraught with heartbreak. We struggled with infertility for years. Each negative pregnancy test, each failed round of IVF was not just a personal sorrow for me, it was a ticking clock for him. His charm began to fray, revealing a desperate, calculating man beneath. I became less of a wife and more of a project. My body was a barren field he was trying to force into bloom. He subjected me to a grueling regimen of treatments, diets, and procedures, all with a clinical detachment that chilled me to the bone. Finally, after 5 years of trying, we were pregnant. His joy was overwhelming, but it was terrifyingly specific. "It's a boy," he would declare, not with hope, but with certainty. "I can feel it." He refused to even entertain the possibility of a daughter. When the ultrasound revealed we were having septuplets, he was ecstatic. "7 chances," he had crowed, his eyes gleaming with manic optimism. "The odds are in our favor now." He forbade me from finding out the genders, claiming he wanted it to be a surprise. In reality, he couldn't bear to have his hope confirmed or denied. He preferred to live in a state of suspended certainty. NTHE pregnancy was incredibly high risk. I was confined to a hospital bed for the final 3 months, my body swelling to an unrecognizable state. Mark was a constant presence, but his concern was not for my health. He would sit by my bedside, not holding my hand, but reading business journals, making plans for the empire he was sure would soon be his. He was counting his chickens before they hatched, and he was only interested in roosters. NTHE delivery was a marvel of modern medicine. A team of specialists worked for hours, and one by one, my 7 daughters were born. With each announcement from the doctor, "It's a girl," I watched a light go out in Mark's eyes. By the time the 7th and final "It's a girl" was announced, his face was a blank slate of utter devastation. The castle had crumbled. NHE was strangely calm in the hours that followed. He was polite to the nurses, he signed the birth certificates, he even held one of the babies for a photo, a dead-eyed smile plastered on his face. I mistook his calm for acceptance, for shock. I thought he was grieving the loss of his dream. I had no idea he was already plotting our disposal. NTHE next day. He insisted on taking us home. The doctors protested, saying the babies were too fragile, that I was still recovering. But Mark was persuasive. He claimed his parents had a full nursing staff waiting for us at their estate. He was so convincing, so seemingly responsible, that the hospital reluctantly discharged us. NHE loaded us into our luxury SUV, the heat blasting. He drove for an hour, chatting amiably about the weather, about a new tractor he was thinking of buying. It was all a performance. Then he turned off the main highway and onto a deserted dirt road, the car bumping along into the deep woods. When he pulled over and the engine went silent, he turned to me, and the mask finally dropped. The charming man I had married was gone. In his place was a stranger with cold eyes and a problem to solve. And we were the problem. He had made a promise to his grandfather, to his legacy, and he was willing to break every vow he had ever made to me to keep it. NTHE, first few minutes after Mark drove away, were a blur of disbelief and freezing terror. The silence he left behind was absolute, broken only by the pathetic, mewling cries of my babies. My mind couldn't process the reality. He would come back. This was a joke, a cruel, monstrous test. He had to come back. NBUT the cold was not a joke. It was a relentless, physical assault. It stole the breath from my lungs and the strength from my limbs. I looked down at the cardboard box. My daughters. My 7 precious, helpless daughters. Their survival depended entirely on me, and I was failing. And a memory surfaced, something I had learned in a botany class years ago. Some seeds need to be frozen before they can germinate. They need to endure the harshest winter to find the strength to grow. The thought was a tiny, insane flicker of hope in the abyss. We would be those seeds. We had to be. I knew we couldn't stay put. We would freeze to death by morning. I had to move. I had to find shelter. I scanned the dark tree line. There was nothing. Just endless, menacing woods. But the road led somewhere. And the problem was the babies. I couldn't carry a cardboard box for miles. I looked down at my hospital gown. It was all I had. With numb, fumbling fingers, I began to tear strips from the hem. I worked frantically, my movements clumsy in the cold. I laid my gown on the ground and placed my daughters in a line down the center. I wrapped the gown around them, creating a long, makeshift papoose. I tied it shut with the strips I had torn. It wasn't much, but it would keep them together and share their minuscule body heat. Lifting them was agony. My body, still ravaged by childbirth, screamed in protest. But I got the bundle into my arms, cradling it against my chest. I began to walk. I stumbled down the dirt road in the direction Mark had gone, my bare feet screaming in pain on the frozen, rocky ground. Every step was a battle. The cold was a physical weight, pressing down on me. My tears froze on my eyelashes. The only thing that kept me moving was the faint, stirring life in my arms. I talked to them, my voice a hoarse whisper. "I've got you," I murmured over and over again. "Mommy's got you. We're going to be warm soon. I promise." And I don't know how long I walked. An hour? 2? Time had lost all meaning. The world had shrunk to the next step, and the next, and the next. I was starting to lose feeling in my feet and hands. A dangerous, sleepy numbness was creeping over me. I knew it was the beginning of the end. I stumbled and fell to my knees, the impact jarring the babies and eliciting a fresh chorus of weak cries. I couldn't get up. I had nothing left. This was it. This was where we would die. I curled my body around the bundle of my children, a final, futile attempt to shield them. "I'm so sorry," I sobbed, my tears now a warm, stinging relief against my frozen skin. "I'm so sorry." And then a light. It was faint at first, a distant glow cresting a hill in front of me. Headlights. A car. Hope, so fierce and powerful it felt like a physical shock, surged through me. I tried to stand, to wave, but my legs wouldn't obey. I tried to scream, but my throat was raw, and only a dry croak came out. The car was getting closer. It was an old, beat-up pickup truck rattling down the road. It was going to pass us. It wasn't going to see us. With the last ounce of my strength, I did the only thing I could. I pushed the bundle of my babies out from my body, further into the middle of the road. It was a terrible gamble, but it was our only chance. I collapsed onto my side, my vision tunneling to black, my last conscious thought a prayer. See them. Please, just see them. The truck screeched to a halt, its headlights illuminating the pathetic bundle in the road like a macabre nativity scene. A door creaked open. I heard the crunch of boots on the gravel, then a man's voice, rough with shock. "And good God Almighty," he whispered. "What in the world?" And I felt hands on me, turning me over. I looked up into a weathered, bearded face, his eyes wide with disbelief under the brim of a worn cap. He looked from me to the bundle and back to me. Understanding, and then a wave of pure, righteous fury dawned on his face. "He left you," the man said, his voice a low growl. "The bastard left you out here." He gently scooped me and my children up, his arms surprisingly strong. He carried us to his truck and blasted the heat, wrapping us in a coarse wool blanket from his back seat that smelled of sawdust and coffee. It was the most luxurious thing I had ever felt. And as the warmth began to painfully thaw my frozen limbs, I looked at my savior. He was just a man, an old hunter or a farmer, probably. But to me, he was an angel in a pickup truck. He had found the fire in the frost. And as he drove us toward the distant, welcoming lights of a town, I knew the winter was over. The season of vengeance was about to begin. In the old man's name was Jed. He was a retired veterinarian who lived a quiet life on the edge of the woods. He didn't take me to a hospital. A hospital means questions, paperwork, and a system that will swallow up your girls before you can even get your feet under you. he'd said with a gruff wisdom. First, you get strong. Then you fight. NHE took me to his home, a small rustic cabin that was warm and cluttered with books and sleeping dogs. His wife, Martha, a retired nurse, met us at the door. She took one look at me and my 7 shivering babies, and her face set in a look of fierce determination. They were a team, forged by a lifetime of mending broken things, and we were the most broken things they had ever seen. NFOR 2 weeks, they nursed us back to health. Martha used her old nursing skills to tend to my postpartum complications and the frostbite on my hands and feet. Jed, with his veterinarian's knowledge of neonatal care, rigged up a warming station for the babies, using heat lamps and incubators he'd once used for puppies. They fed me, clothed me, and wrapped my daughters in warmth and safety. They also listened. I told them the whole story, from the promise of the will to the cold finality in Mark's eyes as he drove away. Jed would listen, his jaw tight, his hands clenching and unclenching. Martha would just nod, her eyes full of a deep, knowing sorrow. Men like that, she said one evening as she helped me bathe the girls. They're not men. They're holes where a soul should be. They consume everything around them to try and fill themselves up, but they're always empty. During those 2 weeks, the world outside the cabin ceased to exist. There was no news, no internet, no phone. It was a cocoon of healing. But I knew it couldn't last. The question of what to do next hung in the air. NTHE answer came from Jed. He had been making quiet inquiries in town, testing the waters. He discovered that Mark had, as expected, inherited his fortune. The day after he abandoned us, on his 30th birthday, he had claimed his birthright. He had told the world a tragic, heroic story. His wife, despondent and suffering from severe postpartum psychosis, had stolen their 7 children from the hospital and vanished. He was playing the part of the grieving husband and father, his face splashed across the news, pleading for my safe return. He had turned me into a villain and a fugitive. He's insulated himself, Jed said, his voice grim. He has the money, the power, and a story that makes him a saint. No one will believe you. So what do? I asked, my heart sinking. How can I fight that? You don't fight him on his territory, Jed said, a shrewd glint in his eye. You create your own. You're a botanist, right? You understand how things grow. We're not going to attack the tree. We're going to poison the roots. Jed's plan was slow, patient, and brilliant. He had a nephew, a quiet, unassuming man who worked as a land surveyor for the county. For the next year, while I raised my daughters in the safety of the cabin, Jed's nephew began a quiet, methodical investigation into the Callaway Empire. He wasn't looking for financial fraud. He was looking at the land itself. NHE surveyed the vast tracts of Callaway farmland, cross-referencing old deeds, water rights agreements, and environmental reports. And he found inconsistencies, small at first, then larger. He discovered that for decades, the Callaway family had been systematically and illegally draining protected wetlands to expand their farmland. They had falsified environmental impact studies and bribed local officials to look the other way. Their entire empire, the source of the fortune Mark had been so desperate to inherit, was built on a foundation of environmental crime. NTHE final piece of the puzzle was a series of anonymous shell corporations that owned the land immediately adjacent to the drained wetlands. These corporations had bought the seemingly worthless swampland for pennies on the dollar years ago, only to have it become prime agricultural land after the illegal draining. And the owner of these shell corporations? Mark's grandfather, the patriarch who had written the will. It was a conspiracy that spanned generations. The will, with its cruel stipulation, wasn't just about ensuring a male heir. It was a mechanism to ensure the family's criminal enterprise remained a secret. The fortune could only be passed to a son who could be trusted to maintain the conspiracy of silence. He didn't just leave you to die for a fortune, Jed explained, laying out the maps and documents on his kitchen table. He left you to die to protect a criminal empire. NWE had him. We had the truth. but we knew we couldn't just go to the authorities. The Callaway influence ran deep in that region. We needed to detonate this information in a way that they couldn't control, couldn't bury, and couldn't escape. We needed a bigger weapon, and I knew just where to find one. NNMY weapon of choice was a woman named Evelyn Reed. She was a nationally renowned investigative journalist, famous for her fearless exposés on corporate corruption and environmental crime. She had a reputation for being relentless and incorruptible. She was also notoriously hard to reach. NFOR weeks, I tried to get through to her, leaving messages that were never returned. Finally, I realized I was going about it the wrong way. I couldn't just send her a tip. I had to send her an undeniable story. And with Jed and Martha's help, I crafted a package. It contained copies of all the documents Jed's nephew had uncovered, the forged environmental reports, the illegal water diversion permits, the deeds to the shell corporations. It also contained a detailed, handwritten account of my own story, from my marriage to the night Mark left us to die. I included a photo of my 7 beautiful, thriving 1-year-old daughters, playing in the grass outside the cabin. I ended the letter with a single sentence. He tried to bury us, not knowing we were seeds. I sent the package not to her office, but to her home address, which Jed had managed to find through an old contact. I sent it with no return address, signed simply Jane Doe. Week later, Evelyn Reed arrived at the cabin. She came alone, driving a rental car. She looked exactly like her photos, sharp, intelligent, with eyes that missed nothing. She held my letter in her hand. "I get 100 tips a week," she said, her voice crisp and direct. Most of them are nonsense. But this is the kind of story that brings down empires. I need to know if it's true. All of it. NFOR 2 days. I told her everything. I showed her my scars. I introduced her to my daughters. She interviewed Jed and Martha and spoke to Jed's nephew via a secure line. She examined every piece of evidence with a forensic level of detail. And at the end of the 2nd day, she closed her notebook. "He's not just a monster," she said, her voice cold with fury. "He's a fool. He left behind the one thing that could destroy him, a witness with nothing left to lose." Nevelyn's investigation was a whirlwind. She and her team descended on the region, but they were discreet. They interviewed disgruntled former Callaway employees, pressured retired county officials, and used satellite imagery to corroborate the land-draining scheme. They built a case so airtight, so damning, that it was irrefutable. NTHE's story broke on a Sunday morning, a massive front-page feature in a major national newspaper and a corresponding television news special. It was called The Barren King. It was a masterpiece of investigative journalism. It wove together the heartbreaking human story of my abandonment with the cold, hard facts of the Callaway family's decades-long environmental crimes. It painted Mark not as a grieving father, but as the callous inheritor of a poisoned legacy, a man willing to let his own children perish to protect a criminal enterprise. NTHE fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Mark. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency launched a massive investigation. The IRS began an audit of the family's entire financial history. State and federal prosecutors started circling. The Callaway brand, once a symbol of American success, became synonymous with greed and corruption. Mark's world imploded. His business partners deserted him. His lines of credit were frozen. The empire he had sacrificed his family for was crumbling into dust around him. He was trapped, not by a stipulation in a will, but by the consequences of his own monstrous actions. The poison tree his family had cultivated for generations was being uprooted, and he was being dragged down with it. NTHE legal battles that followed were long and complex, but their outcome was never in doubt. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the Callaway empire collapsed. The company was hit with record-breaking fines from the EPA, fines so large they bankrupted the business. The illegally acquired land was seized by the state to be restored as a nature preserve. The fortune was gone, and Mark, along with several of his executives and the corrupt local officials, was indicted on federal charges of conspiracy, fraud, and a host of environmental crimes. He was convicted and sentenced to a long term in federal prison. The man who had feared being poor more than anything else in the world would spend the best years of his life in a concrete cell. With the help of a lawyer Evelyn Reed had connected me with, I filed a civil suit against him. It was never about the money. It was about justice for my daughters. The court awarded us a settlement that consisted of the last of his non-seized personal assets. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough. It was a beginning, and I used the money to buy a small farm, a few acres of good, honest land far away from the poisoned fields of the Callaway Empire. It was a place where my girls could run and play, where they could learn about the resilience of nature, about the cycle of planting and harvesting. We named it Seven Seeds Farm, NJED, and Martha, our saviors and now our family, moved into a small cottage on our property. Their wisdom and love were the bedrock of our new life. We lived simply, surrounded by a community that knew our story and embraced us for our strength, not our victimhood. My daughters grew up strong and wild and free. They were 7 unique individuals, yet they moved through the world as a unit, a sisterhood forged in the coldest fire. They were brilliant and kind, and they understood the value of loyalty and the true meaning of family. They knew who their father was, and they knew what he had done. But his story was not their story. It was just the prologue to their own incredible tale. And I never remarried. My life was full. My love was poured into my daughters and into the land we cultivated. I found my peace not in a man's promise, but in the reliable turning of the seasons, in the satisfaction of a day's hard work, and in the sound of my children's laughter. Years later, when my daughters were young women, a letter arrived from the prison where Mark was incarcerated. It was a short, stilted letter, filled with self-pity and blame. He wrote that he had been a victim of his family's legacy, that he had been under immense pressure. He asked for forgiveness. He asked to see his daughters. And I gathered my 7 girls in our living room, the fire crackling in the hearth, and I read them the letter. I told them the choice was theirs. And it was my quietest daughter, Willow, who spoke first. She walked to the window and looked out at the fields, now resting under a blanket of snow. "When a tree is diseased," she said, her voice soft but sure, "you don't just prune the branches. You have to remove it completely so it doesn't poison the soil for everything else. We are what grew in the clean soil. We have no room for his disease." They all agreed. They felt no hatred for him, only a distant, clinical pity. He was a part of their biology, but he was not a part of their lives. He had chosen his harvest, and we had chosen ours. NNTHE years unfolded like the seasons on our farm, each with its own beauty and challenges. My daughters blossomed. They went to college, pursued their passions, and became remarkable women. One became an environmental lawyer, fighting the very kind of corruption that had defined her father's family. Another became a doctor, specializing in neonatal care. A third took over our farm, using her botany degree to turn it into a thriving organic enterprise. They were 7 seeds grown into a magnificent perennial garden. I grew old, my hair turning the color of winter frost, my hands weathered from a lifetime of working the earth. My life was a rich tapestry woven with the love of my daughters, my grandchildren, and the enduring friendship of Jed and Martha, who lived out their days with us. One crisp autumn evening, I was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a warm blanket, watching the sun set over the fields. My eldest daughter, Tara, came and sat beside me. She was a mother herself now, with a daughter who had my eyes. "I was thinking today," she said, "about that first night, about how cold it must have been." And I looked at her, my heart full. "It was," I said. "But I remember the fire too, the anger. It was the only thing that kept me warm." "It wasn't just anger, Mom," she said, taking my hand. "It was love. They're the same thing sometimes, aren't they? 2 sides of the same coin. A love so fierce it burns away everything else. That's what saved us." Not just your anger, but the fire of your love. I looked out at the land, at the home we had built. I thought of the man in a prison cell, a man who had everything and ended up with nothing. I thought of myself, a woman who had been left with nothing and had ended up with everything that mattered. NHE had left me without even a blanket, hoping the cold would be the end of our story. But he didn't understand the nature of life. He didn't understand that some things don't die in the frost. They wait, they gather their strength, and when the spring comes, they grow back, stronger and more beautiful than ever before. He had left me with only my tears for warmth, but from those salty, heartbroken tears, a garden had grown, and it was a garden that would bloom for generations.